Hi, I'm Andrew Tsao. In this online edition of Backstory, we'll preview a film called We Go Way Back, which was director and writer Lynn Shelton's first feature film. It's a heartfelt, fascinating piece about a young woman who examines her life and unexpectedly encounters her 13-year-old self. Welcome to the show, Lynn. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
You know, it made me think about the ages you chose in respect to the 13-year-old girl who ends up encountering her 23-year-old self. And I was just thinking that, you know, in life we talk about moments of transformation and change, and they're typically something like, you know, you turn 18 and you're eligible for the draft, or you turn 30 and, you know, those are significant ages. From your point of view in making the story, what was it about those particular ages in a young woman's life that sort of became the centerpieces of the story for you?
When I made the film, I was in my late 30s, and there was something about, I think, there was just where I was at in my life. For some reason, I was looking back at all these different selves that I had been.
Okay.
And with, you know, sort of a retrospective point of view, and the ones I was most struck by in their disparateness was the pre and post-adolescent self.
Okay.
And because right before I hit adolescence, and you know, it may be very far from the actual reality, but what I remember is being just filled with this power, this sort of androgynous freedom, and a real clarity of vision and a really unstoppable creative output, you know, and then that just somehow got squashed to a certain degree by adolescence. So at the other end of adolescence, I was a very different person, and I went through this phase of just feeling much more lost and unsure of myself and swayed by winds that shouldn't have been swaying me, and lost that clarity of vision in it, you know, and just got this sort of fuzzy feeling around the borders of myself. So I thought that it would be really interesting to put those two such completely different you know, people in the same room, and wasn't sure if I was going to do it in a really visceral way, like physically have them in the same room or not, but I just wanted them to encounter each other somehow. And
so through the process of working on the story, the ultimate manner in which you bring them together came about.
Yeah, it was definitely it was an evolution, you know, trying to find what that was going to be. Was I going to do a sort of sci-fi thing where she was actually going to go back in time? Would it be metaphorical, where this young girl would show up and kind of be, you know, sort of show up in her life and be a you know, more symbolic of her younger self?
Perhaps someone else who reminds her of her.
Yeah, but I ultimately decided to do a kind of magic surrealistic turn and actually have her, the real two selves appear, but without dwelling too hard on how it happened, you know, how, you know, like there's
well, that's another aspect that makes the film really interesting, in that as I thought about it, you know, it isn't a film that I can categorize, or I don't think people can categorize in a genre. You know, you said you thought about, would this be something that was in the area of a phenomenon of science fiction when she encounters it, but it's not. The film has a whimsical element. The film has deeply dramatic moments. It's truthful. It's very authentic to the point of view of this one woman and her life. Can you talk a little bit about your own filmmaking aesthetic and what we are going to see in the film that you can sort of point to, that tells us about how you see filmmaking and perhaps maybe influences that you borrowed or reshaped so that you could tell this story? Wow.
I mean, I can say first and foremost that I started as an actor. I actually went to the theater school at the University of Washington, and was always drawn to honesty and authenticity and naturalism. And as an actor, was actually told often that I should work in film and in front of a camera, because I sometimes had a hard time communicating to the back row and having that sort of larger than life quality. You know, I just wanted to be very small and honest, and that was kind of where my work was, that was where I was drawn to. And I worked a lot in the 90s in documentary film, and was fascinated by real people speaking real words and wanted to emulate that in my narrative work.
I see.
So that was something that was a huge influence. I also made a lot of experimental films and was very entranced by the visceral beauty and poetic, the visual poetry,
Yes.
and the auditory. I mean, cinema is the medium that can emulate human experience most closely, I think, more closely than any other medium. And you've got all these different, it's like a matrix of all these different languages that make up the cinematic lexicon.
Right.
So even just the choices with the camera alone, what length of lens and what depth of field, and what's the frame going to be? Is there going to be motion in it? You know, all those things can convey something that's going to enhance the emotion or the drama of the story. So I like to put all of that to use. And there's so many different examples of that. But
well,
yeah.
I see now that what's so fascinating is that there is a sense of the real person being observed that I think speaks to your documentary background, but at the same time, there's a very, very clear visual style at work in the film. Let's talk a little bit about the actors before we look at the film. I have a hard time imagining anyone else other than Amber playing this role. And I say that because so much of the role is unspoken, and it's a sense of an understanding of a point of crisis in a life. And I'm just interested to know, you know, how you connected that story with her, and ultimately on the larger landscape, since you already touched on it in terms of your interest in what actors do, what it is you were looking for in the actors, and what you do as a director to sort of know that this is something you're going to be able to make work visually.
Yeah, well, it was an absolutely fascinating process for me because it was the first time I'd ever worked as a director with actors. I'd worked as an actor with actors, and I sort of came at it from that point of view. I thought, well, I'm going to be sort of the buddy director, like I'm going to be, you know, I'm just up here because I'm coming from, I'm sort of an actor director. And I learned so much. I learned a ton during this process. But it started with auditioning. I'd only ever been on the other side of the audition table, you know, and so I had incredible empathy for the actors, and I knew that I wanted to put them at ease and to make them feel, you know, sort of loved in that process, because it's so awful. It's such a horrible, it can be a very difficult process, and you're so vulnerable. And what I discovered too was very eye-opening as a former actor, realizing that, oh, it really isn't personal. Like the fact, every time I didn't get a part, it had nothing to do with me personally. It was really that there's this particular vision, and there's so many different elements that, you know, that have to be just right in order for you to get the role. And so I auditioned. I tried to audition every young woman in her 20s in Seattle.
Really? You went that wide?
Whoever I could. Yeah, I mean, it felt that way anyway. Yeah. That's what we tried. It ended up only being 40 or 50 people, but it felt like quite a few. And I think I called back about 10.
Okay.
And I mean, I saw an incredible range of talent, just huge talent. But those 10, I remember in particular, were just, every one of them were just superb. They were wonderful. But I was looking for this particular quality, somebody who could exude an extreme amount of vulnerability and emotion and sort of in their eyes, and, you know, in an unspoken way, and, you know, had access to that, because she needed to really be vulnerable and lost. And it's a very difficult role because she's so passive.
Well, the thing is, she's vulnerable and lost, and you're right, but you found an actress who's still active. You feel the search, you feel the longing, and you're right, that's the trick, right?
Yeah,
I mean, it's like
exactly.
we are compelled to be with her because we know she's not just given up or reactive to the world. She's engaged in it and searching.
She's trying. Yeah, she's trying. Exactly.
That's
yeah.
great.
And it really seemed like fate. She was one of the last actresses I looked at, actually, and I was about to give up because I just couldn't find somebody who was quite, you know, what I needed for the role. And then she came in, and not only did she seem to be able to give me what I wanted, but she also happened to look a lot like the young girl that I wanted to use, and that just seemed like fate. You know, it was crazy. Yeah,
that was total coincidence.
It really was, because I already knew Maggie. In fact, I had made this short experimental film with Maggie Brown, who plays the 13-year-old. The summer before, just 6 months before, I dragged her out to the woods to my folks' cabin on Whidbey Island, and I sort of had her. Having all these intense sense memories of what it was like to be at that age, and I was sort of just drawing my forces together. You know, spending a lot of time alone in the woods and in this canoe on the lake, and so I sort of made her retrace all of those activities and followed her around with a camera, and that was really the seed of the feature.
So it comes from personal memory, which
definitely
really comes across well. Now, let's take a look at the trailer for the film We Go Way Back.
Dear Kate at 23. Hey, what's up, grown-up me? How's life? Do you have a boyfriend? Still love Carson McCall? Are you still best friends with Maxie? Where do you live? Seattle? Paris? Wherever you are. I hope you're doing exactly what you want to do. If you ever get sad, having a really good time. Remember that I was thinking of you once. But I guess I can't anymore because now I'm you. So maybe you can think about me once in a while. That'd be nice. Bye for now. Love, Kate at 13.
Since this film, you've made 2 other features?
Yes, I'm
Okay.
just finishing up.
You're just finishing
my
up
fourth.
another one?
Yeah.
A 4th now? You're already on 4.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I made a web series in there too. Anyway, it was like a feature.
Good
but
for you.
Thank you.
So, Lynn, looking at the film, the visual style, jump cuts, soft focus, the interesting framing and composition. Before we watched, you talked a little bit about how documentary and human behavior in that manner affected the way you looked at actors. And then you talked a little bit about some of the experimental films you made. But in this film, I see a very disciplined and consistent style that you're working in to let us see the world through the main character's eyes. Can you talk a little bit about that style?
Yeah, I really wanted the audience to experience her experience and to be drawn into the character in a very at a gut level, what she was going through. And so some of those things you referred to, the focus sort of coming in and out very consciously, the handheld, occasional use of slow motion. Those elements are meant to represent that fuzziness I was referring to that she feels, you know, at the boundary of herself, where do the edges of her begin and end, and where is her place in the world. And so that in general, you know, that reflects, especially in those moments in the film where she's feeling that most strongly, that's when I use them. And I alternate, because there are some scenes that are completely actually very Ozu. I had just seen a retrospective of the Japanese director Ozu, and so I also wanted to have a few scenes that were wide, on tripod, and just still, and have things unfold. So in her apartment, usually she's
static shots.
Static shots.
Now,
right.
if we're going to talk about Mr. Ozu, then we have to say, did you place the camera 36 inches above the floor from the point of view of someone sitting on a tatami mat with a 50mm lens?
I didn't go all the way.
For those of you who are watching, Yasujiro Ozu, the great director, was a highly disciplined filmmaker in that he chose to shoot, I think, over 60 features, but used one lens in 35mm, which was a 50, and his point of view of the camera was always somewhere around here.
And very deep fields.
Deep
often,
fields view.
people
However,
crossing
that disciplined language was also highly poetic, and that's what we're talking about here.
That's how I found it. I'd never seen his work before, and I think the Northwest Film Forum actually had a retrospective of his work like a month before I started going to production. And it just blew my mind.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I did. It was that poetry I responded to, but I also was deeply influenced at the time by filmmakers like Lynn Ramsey, who kind of goes in the opposite direction, uses a lot of handheld, and is, again, very photographic, very visually poetic with her work, but in a very different way, like pretty much the opposite end of the spectrum. So I liked the idea of being able to go back and forth between those two kind of vocabularies. You referred to the jump cuts, and that was another experiment in trying to recreate a particular experience. I think that it's in the very first sex scene that's in the sort of the blue, it's a lighting booth, nobody can ever tell where it is, but it's a blue room. There's a lot of jump cuts in there, and it comes from out of nowhere for her, this experience, and she's sort of letting it happen. And so I wanted to try to illustrate that sense of her being overwhelmed. And like she could only kind of gulp the experience in little shallow bits, you know, and it's like, oh, he's kissing me now, and then, oh, now this is happening, and this is happening, and, you know, and so it's like she can only experience it in a sort of weird, chopped up little way, kind of the way that memory often works for us, but it was so intense at the time that she's actually experiencing like that in real time. So yeah, I was experimenting a lot with those kinds of, and a few POV shots at the end of that scene. She's looking right into his face.
Right.
Yeah, I wanted you, again, it was all in the quest of trying to give you her world.
Her world, yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the music in the film, which also, to me, is a character. It's very specific. It takes place at specific junctures. And it's not just underscoring, it actually speaks to and advances the story for us in terms of what's happening with the character. Can you talk a little bit about some of the choices you made and how they came about?
Yeah, I mean, the music and the sound design, and sometimes there's a real blurry line between the two. There's a lot of music that ends up being soundscape that ends up, you know, and transitioning between them. It's the most music and sound-driven movie I've ever made to date. And again, very evocative, very poetic, very visceral. You know, I've heard people say that the visuals actually convey the information and the sound conveys the emotion. So I felt like sound was just as important as visuals in this piece. The main person who provides the music is Laura Viers, who was a Seattle-based singer-songwriter for a long time and has since moved to Portland, but still Northwest. And she was introduced to me quite by accident. I was at my dad's cabin in Eastern Washington trying to write the script. Right at the beginning when I was trying to write the script, I was borrowing his computer, and he like checked his email or something and turned on this music, and as I was writing, I was listening to this voice, and I just became completely besotted with her. I didn't know who it was. I'd never heard her before, and it turned out she was in Seattle, and I actually had a connection to her because my brother's wife was working with her boyfriend or something crazy. I had some crazy connection. So when I actually started stalking her, which I kind of did because I knew she had to be connected with the film, something about her lyrics and her voice, I just had a feeling that she was going to be the right fit. She took very kindly to the stalking and luckily agreed to collaborate. So that was enormous. I mean, she provides probably about 50% of the music. And the most important, you know, the very beginning, the very end, and the middle, and then there's a couple of other moments. And then there's a lot of music, also a lot of pop music, a lot of songs. And my friend Sean Nelson, who I was just sort of starting to become friends with, we ended up collaborating on my second feature film. He stars in my second feature film, My Effortless Brilliance. But at the time, we were just getting to know each other, and he was a singer in a rock band, Harvey Danger, a local band, and he was also a host on Audio Oasis on KXP, which is a local music show. I knew he had a lot of his pulse on the local music scene. So he gave me a CD before we even started shooting of all of these different, you know, having just read the script.
And they're all local then?
And they're all local, all of them, yeah. And so he introduced me to all this wonderful local music, and I actually had Amber listen to some of the songs on set because they were so appropriate, and so he was the one who hooked me up with the rest of the music. And then Vinnie Smith did this incredible job he was my sound designer, and he just interwove that music into the sound design, and these moments of disassociation and you know, kind of psychodrama going on for her. He really enhanced all of that. So,
you know, so that leads me to the last question I'd like to talk with you about. You know, I've heard today from you that so much of the seed of the film was from personal experience, but personal experience in Washington, growing up here. And you talked about casting the film here, and now you've talked about music and how certain relationships created doorways into finding the sound for the film. I look at the film, we go way back, and as someone who also grew up here in the Northwest, I go, well, that's a Northwest film. Now, I don't even know what that means, but I know it when I see it, Lynn.
Yeah.
So help us understand this and help us understand what it means to be a Northwest filmmaker.
I'll do my best, but that's exactly the reaction I have. I don't even know what that means. And I think it's probably because having grown up here and the Northwest is such a part of my soul that, and not having grown up anywhere else, I don't know what it would be like to make a film with a different mindset. I'm sure it would be different. I mean, I'm sure that there are a lot of elements that would be very different. I mean, obviously the film is Northwest because it's made here, so you see the specific kind of light and the color of this, you know, the angle of the sun and all the different, and then you're in the woods a lot. We shot in Seattle, but we also, you know, in Ballard, but we also shot in the Key Peninsula and in Whidbey Island. In Whidbey Island, so you see a lot of, you know, there's a cathedral of trees at one point, and you know, there's a lot of greenery. But so there's those physical elements. But when I look beyond that, and people have tried to talk to me about this before as well, and I'm so I have such a hard time talking about it because I don't know what to say, you know. But I totally believe it when people tell me, well, your rhythms and the way that you use the camera, you know, all of those things. I mean, one thing I can say is that I'm working outside of this traditional paradigm. First of all, I never went to film school. I started in the theater, and then I moved to New York to do theater. Theater and I had a falling out, and I ended up in photography school, which was always my sort of second love, and I ended up following that, which led me to documentary and experimental filmmaking, and I became an editor, and that was sort of how I was making my way, you know, financially. And I started I came back to Seattle to have my kid, and I started editing all these narrative films, and that was when I realized, oh, I want to direct narrative films. So it was this weird, circuitous route here, and I wasn't in LA or New York when I made my first feature, so I didn't have anybody telling me this is the way that you do it, this is what your script needs to be. And there was this wonderful visionary company at the time, which was a nonprofit called the Film Company, who told me, you know, they said, we don't want you to think about the commercial impact that this film might have on the marketplace. Tell your story, just make a good piece of art. And so it was very, I really think that affects filmmaking, both the idea of doing it regionally outside of New York and LA. And I'm fascinated by other people making, you know, these little filmmaking communities around the country in you know, Birmingham and Memphis and Nashville and Chicago and Austin and all these places that aren't New York and LA. And I'm realizing it's really rare. You know, I went to Sundance a couple years ago, and it really finally hit me when the 30th time in a day that somebody asked me, "Are you from New York or LA?" And I'm like, you know, and I say Seattle, and their jaw just drops, and they're like, "Well, when are you moving to New York or LA?" And I'm like, "Never. I'm never moving ever from Seattle. This is where I am, and this is why I really feel strongly about there being. I want to support the viability of a local film industry, so I can stay here and keep making films, and my crew can stay here and make a living, and you know, continue to work with me. So
well, of course, that's really what we hope this program is a part of as well. That's sort of our theme. Lynn, I can't thank you enough for coming in and talking with us. It's a beautiful film, and I also want to wish you the best on your future projects, and can't wait to talk to you more about film and what you're doing next. And I also, in our next interview, which I'm going to try to commit you to do with me, I need to hear about your falling out with theater. I'm Andrew Tsao. You've been watching Backstory, and I will see you very soon again behind the scenes. Thanks a lot.